Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on AI-assisted efficiency in food and beverage in partnership with Food and Beverage Ontario and hosted by Icicle Technologies. I'm Romina Puno and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Thank you for joining us. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording today's session, so you can refer to it in the future and share with those who couldn't join us. You will also have questions and answers at the end of the session. So until then, please use the chat feature to enter your questions throughout the session or send me a direct message if you'd like to ask anonymously. And thank you for all of you who have sent your questions in advance. That is fantastic. We'll go through these one by one at the end of today's session. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Burton, the creator of award-winning food production management system, Icicle. Icicle offers a complete solution for smart automation, improving quality standards, production efficiency, and expanding growth opportunities for all types of food businesses. Now, with AI-enabled features, Icicle helps food and beverage manufacturers protect profitability and move their businesses forward into the future. Steve's background in manufacturing and consulting, combined with sophisticated software development expertise, gives him a unique perspective on today's topic. Over to you, Steve.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Happy to see you here. We're going to embark on a journey to demystify artificial intelligence, also called AI, in the food industry. And what we'll do is we'll explore AI and shed light on what its capabilities, applications are, specifically in the context of the food industry. So first of all, who are we? We're the creators of Icicle. We develop software for food manufacturers, and we're very much into AI. Myself, I'm a technologist with originally a manufacturing background, and then a background in food production software specifically. And basically, the fact that I have both experience on the manufacturing side and the AI side through my software development efforts helps sort of inform my view on it. So I'll share some of that with you today. So essentially, you should be at this webinar if you're really new to AI. I've attended and given quite a few talks, and sometimes they're sort of overly general, like the computer science side of what AI is. Sometimes they're highly specific and detailed. We're not shooting for either of those. We're trying to go really for somewhere in the middle and find something that's kind of provides an overview for people that may be new to the topic, but we're not going to do a super deep dive. And we'll help really focus on the practical applications of AI, and we'll help you stay ahead of the curve in terms of the latest sort of trends and innovations in AI. And there's quite a few things coming down the pike for you in that regard. And we've also launched a kind of an AI alliance that you might want to be aware of. And what that is it's essentially a place where we can collaborate with others, because there's hardware manufacturers, there's software manufacturers, there's people that have consulting expertise, AI expertise. Nobody really has all the tools that are required. So collaboration and working together makes much higher success rates for AI-enabled projects. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Specifically, the agenda for today is to talk about the fundamentals, because a lot of people don't know what AI is. So we're going to want to give them an indication of what AI means to people and how to differentiate sort of confusing concepts. And we'll also talk specifically, though, about the applications in the food industry. And we'll talk about how to manage the transition from your current sort of legacy processes towards AI, and about the next steps that you might want to take to help you prepare and to stay ahead of the coming changes. So first of all, I just want to clear up a really common kind of misconception about AI. And I've given sort of similar talks quite a few times. And one problem that people really have is understanding the difference between sort of going digital and artificial intelligence. And so if you're currently on a manual system where you're writing things on pens and paper, that is, and you want to go to a computer-based system, that's really kind of going digital, and has nothing to do necessarily with AI. So AI is artificial intelligence, and it's kind of a different concept from simply going digital. So another thing I want to talk a little bit about before we get into the details is sort of the fears and the realities of AI. So one concern that a lot of people have is around data privacy and security. This is a real concern. If you're using ChatGPT, for example, today, you're typing things in there. You may be making information available, so you don't want to really put super, secure or sensitive information because you want to protect the privacy of your data. It's not like they're, skimming ChatGPT to look for, your super secret passwords, but, as a best practice, I wouldn't put your super secret passwords in there in the first place. So be cognizant of data privacy and security anytime you let it out of your view. Another one is kind of dependence on technology. So people are worried that, our brains are essentially going to turn to mush because, we're too dependent on AI. And there's something to be said for that, but our brains are pretty much amazing organs. Neuroplasticity is an incredible evolutionary benefit. So I think what's going to happen is certain things that, we may be good at right now will be overtaken by AI, but it's going to open up at the same time a lot of other doors. So I'm not really worried too much about the dependence on the technology problem. Another concern people have is loss of control. This is particularly of concern, if you sort of have a managed silo of your own responsibilities within your organization, and you may not be in a position where, you want to lose control over that. It's a valid concern. But it's going to, overall, the adoption of AI is going to help you dramatically increase your productivity and your value to the organization. So I wouldn't put too much a weight on that particular concern. AI malfunctions. AIs do malfunction. So the idea that it's going to kind of completely run amok is unlikely. But AI currently, its current state of development, does what they call hallucinate, which means that it can give you kind of misleading or erroneous answers. So you absolutely need to be very careful about how you use it and kind of do reality checks to make sure it's not misleading you. Generally, valid concern, not super important. Loss of jobs to automation. This is going to be a major event that's going to overtake most companies where certain sort of repetitive and mundane jobs are going to be overtaken. I think we can look back on history and see many cases where that's happened before. Development of the word processor, for example, put all kinds of people that were working in typing pools out of business. Not very many jobs for typewriter repairmen anymore as a result of that as well. So loss of jobs to automation is a concern. And I think the important thing for that is that both government and as business leaders, we need to be kind of sensitive and aware of what the effects are going to be on people and help them through the transition and help people kind of make it to the next stage in their career. Bias and fairness. This is another concern where people are really worried that bias may come in, and there's really two types of bias. There's bias that's based on the data that the AI systems are trained upon, and that's quite a valid concern. But there's also another kind of bias, which is kind of people don't like the results that are coming out of the AI. So you have to be careful that you're not introducing your own bias when you're judging the AI results. So I think it's important to make sure that your AI is kind of not hard-coded to give you particular answers, because the real power of it is that it can kind of uncover unexpected connections and make predictions that might not be obvious to you otherwise. So you don't really want to ruin that part. So let's now get into kind of what AI is. So AI is not really kind of a hard thing. It's really a concept. So the concept is the simulation of human intelligence by machines. So it's really it's a branch of computer science. And what it is essentially programming computer systems to be able to simulate human intelligence. And it's not really a new concept at all. In fact, you might be surprised to learn that the original foundation of AI was back in 1950. So Alan Turing was instrumental, published a paper on the subject back in 1950. By the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of sort of early enthusiasm, and then there was what they call a winter subsequent to that, where not much happened for quite a while. But then there was a resurgence in the 1980s, and the first successful commercial expert system was actually developed at that particular time. And by the 1990s, once the internet came in, which provided a pool of data that could be used to help these, or to train these models and the development of machine learning algorithms, that was really the kind of start of the modern push in AI. One of the big seminal events there was IBM's Deep Blue, which was the first computer chess playing system that could beat a reigning world champion. In the 2000s, big data and deep learning became kind of all the rage. And then in the 2010s, it really started to go mainstream, culminating in the 2020s, where you saw ChatGPT come up, and now it's, of course, become completely mainstream and everybody's using it. One of the things that a lot of people, kind of experience is that, once you've learned your career, you've mastered your domain, and all of a sudden there's this huge change, coming. And my suggestion to you here would be to kind of embrace the change, because it's a scary concept when your work environment and your world is going to undergo changes. People are just sort of fundamentally resistant to change in general. But I think in this case, we really do have to embrace it and kind of go with it and learn from it. And it's going to really help you dramatically in the long run. So there's a lot of people who kind of always oppose these sorts of major developments. The example I was using here was from William Orton, who said that the telephone had too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. We all know that the telephone actually ended up doing quite well. So I would suggest to you that you consider AI kind of the same way. So in terms of getting into the nitty-gritty a little bit about what AI is, it's important to kind of consider it and what it is, and also what it's not. It's important to consider kind of the three flavors of AI. So there's narrow AI or weak AI. I also like to call it sort of dumb AI sometimes, which is systems that are designed only for very specific tasks. So they're very good at those tasks, but they're not good at every task. So some examples of that are like Siri or Alexa or self-driving cars like Tesla. They're recommendation systems used by online platforms like Amazon. These systems are designed to kind of help you make decisions or take over operations that you would normally do manually yourself. But they don't do general things. You can't ask Siri to make you toast, for example. That's not something that's going to be able to do. Or you can't ask it. We can ask it anything you want, but it's not going to give you reasonable answers if you want to sort of generate a list of every possible fruit that exists or something like that. So they're trained on specific models, and they're only good at those tasks that they're trained upon. Then there's the notion of general artificial intelligence. This is really kind of where everybody is going on the software side of the world where I live, and it's essentially the ability to create computer systems that have human-like intelligence and in a kind of general way. And so far, we are nowhere close to that. There's a lot of argument in the industry about where we are at the moment, but my take on that is we're probably still about 25 years away from general artificial intelligence. And then there's artificial superintelligence, ASI, and that's what that is the computer systems that surpass human intelligence, and it's going to go beyond us. And probably is coming, is my guess. Again, the arguments rage about how far out it is. my take on that is that we're probably at least 50 years away from that, but others disagree. Ray Kurzweil, for example, one of the sort of founding fathers of the AI space, predicts that this is going to occur in about 2045. So, much sooner than I would guess. But he said that 20 years ago as well. Now he feels it's much closer. But the point for us in our current kind of business environment is that we're nowhere close to either AGI or ASI. So what we're talking about really is, what we're talking about really is only narrow AI right now. So narrow AI is quite limited. And I asked ChatGPT actually what its limitations were. I won't read it all to you, but my takeaway on that is that it's really not as intelligent as it kind of appears to be. And my biggest takeaway overall is that it really can't kind of learn as it interacts with you. So the way these large language models work is that there's an enormous amount of training data. The system is trained on it, which consumes the equivalent amount of energy to what the UK uses in like 3 months. So enormous training effort goes into it, and then once it's trained, it can interact with you. It can appear to be quite intelligent, but it can't incorporate new knowledge into its model until it's retrained. So that's one major limitation that you might want to be aware of. So we're all here today to talk really about the food industry. So what is the use of AI in the food industry? And essentially, these 4 areas are kind of low-hanging fruit that you might want to really consider. So, the ability to make better predictions. So it can go out, it can look at historical training data. It can also look at data from other sources, outside sources, like, even weather or consumer trends, things like that. And it can make better predictions. It's important to note that we're not talking about perfect predictions here. So you're not going to, have some sort of a crystal ball that's going to allow you to peer clearly into the future. But what it is going to do is it'll be better generally than human predictions. That's the important thing. It's really not that it's perfect. It's just that it's got to be better than us. And I think because of the vast quantities of information that it can assimilate and analyze, the odds are that you're going to get better predictions than a human could generate. You can increase production velocity. For example, automating quality control checks is one really good way to achieve that. It's constantly attentive. So again, if you're looking at quality control checks, you got product running down a line, you have somebody watching the product to make sure, they can be distracted quite easily for a moment or two, and then boom, you've got a quality control problem. Where these systems are, constantly attentive, they never take a nap, they never take a break, they don't get distracted. And you can also help with efficient resource utilization. One area where that really can help is, in product formulations, for example, where you can kind of look at alternatives to existing formulations that may be more efficient. Energy consumption is another good example of that. So I want to talk about a few specific examples here, and I'm going to also show you a couple of quick video clips that kind of give you an indication of where the industry is at the moment. So in terms of like one area where there's a lot of opportunity is in production automation. And a lot of times when people think about AI, they think about production. There's a whole nother side of it as well, which is all the business process automation that can happen as well. But in this particular part, we'll just talk about the production automation part. So, having equipment that can operate autonomously, and robotics, which is closely related to AI. Robotics and AI are kind of different things, but the AI can really power robotics, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. Another place where you can really use it is in production planning and the reporting side, and then also automating material handling and sorting, and I'll show you a video clip of that one as well. So let's look at one example now. This is figure 1 from which is a collaboration with OpenAI. Figure One is actually a company, and they've partnered with OpenAI to bring speech-to-speech reasoning to computer systems. So let's have a look at that.
Hey, Figure One, what do you see right now?
I see a red apple on a plate in the center of the table, a drying rack with cups and a plate, and you standing nearby with your hand on the table.
Great, can I have something to eat?
Sure thing.
Great. Can you explain why you did what you just did while you pick up this trash?
On it. So I gave you the apple because it's the only edible item I could provide you with from the table.
Great. So, based on the scene right now, where do you think the dishes in front of you go next?
The dishes on the table, like that plate and cup, are likely to go into the drying rack next.
Great. Can you put them there?
Of course.
All right, so how do you think you did?
I think I did pretty well. The apple found its new owner, the trash is gone, and the tableware is right where it belongs.
I agree. Thanks, Figure One.
You're welcome. If there's anything else you need help with, just let me know.
Another thing I wanted to show you was the production scheduling. And this is actually an interface from our application. And what it does is it creates production for schedules based on planned production, book sales, existing inventory levels, traditional stuff like that. And in addition to that, though, you can augment that with AI so that you can bring in other factors that are more difficult to incorporate generally. So things like weather patterns, consumer trends, various sorts of external elements can help you react faster. Well, first of all, it'll allow you to forecast better in the future, and also act faster if something happens. Like recently we had a massive interest rate increase. So the fine-tuning your prediction models using artificial intelligence to help you react more quickly is a big advantage of AI, and that's one of the things that we do. There's another video here, and this is kind of the state of the art in terms of what robotics can do, driven by AI. And this robot that you're seeing right here has been instructed to go and pick up some boxes and move them to a conveyor belt, and you're going to watch it do it. The big kind of interesting aspect of this particular clip isn't, kind of the speed with which the robot's moving, which is a little on the slow side, and also the fact that it has to be tethered isn't really ideal. But it's the general application of the AI that's allowed an operator to just to tell it, go move those crates from point A to point B. And the fact that the system can interpret those instructions and do that autonomously without having to, be specifically programmed for each kind of movement along the way is a huge advance. And that's going to really change the world of material handling going forward, I think. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit now about kind of how you can use AI in food safety and quality control, specifically around contamination prevention. So you can use AI to help you control your biological, physical, chemical, radiological hazards. You can automate visual inspections, which is a really great one because, and I'll show you a little video clip of that, which we don't really need audio for either. But I was down in Oklahoma at a food production facility a couple of months ago, and I saw a machine that was running, and there were 5 operators working on the machine, 1 person actually operating the machine, 4 others doing quality control checks coming out the other end. All of those quality control check processes could be automated using AI, and there would be obviously considerable savings involved, and the ability for those workers to do more useful tasks than simply check the quality of the stuff coming out of the machines. So that's another area where it can be used. We currently use it already for predictive hazard identification. So what this does is it allows you to kind of take an ingredient that you might not have ever used before, and the system will help you identify what the hazards are. So biological, chemical, physical, radiological. And previously what happened, for any of you who ever created a HACCP plan, you would know that you would, kind of have the ingredient and you would Google it, or you would look it up in, books or whatever, and it would identify kind of what the hazards are. And it was quite a laborious process to find. If you have a large product line, like we have clients have 2,000 different ingredients, to go through each one and determine what the hazards are can be quite onerous. So this is a way that AI can really help you kind of hone in and identify what those hazards are. And I'll show you an example in a minute. Also, automated monitoring and reporting is another area. So if you want to get kind of reports when anomalies occur, to be able to identify where the anomalies are in your reporting, this is an area where AI can be very useful. And defect detection, which is really part of the quality control functionality as well. So here's a case study here. So currently, you might be doing swab tests. Most companies are. There is a company here, and we can give you the link if you're interested in reading the paper. But they've developed a light scattering sensor that can actually shine on a surface and identify the pathogens. And I found this one was an interesting study because we actually did a joint project with the University of British Columbia to develop a very similar device where you could scan a food contact surface and then identify where the pathogens are. We actually got it to the point where we could identify whether or not there were bacteria, but we couldn't get sufficient resolution to be able to identify the specific species in terms of whether it was a harmful variant or not. So the fact that somebody else has managed to do that is great. Hopefully we'll see those soon. And the way that AI kind of fits in here is it'll look at the telemetry that's coming from the device and to be able to kind of assimilate that and identify what the hazards are, right down to the species level, or what the pathogens are, right down to the species level is a huge advance. That's going to make this possible, I believe. Another place where you can use it in the food safety side is developing SOPs. So, that's a bit of a tedious process, usually only has to be done once and then reviewed annually. But if you kind of have a specific use case in terms of your SOP, like, for example, a weekly sanitation system, you can kind of use AI to help you quickly build the SOP. So what you're seeing here in the screen is that you've got the AI assist button. And when you click that, it'll actually generate text for you. Kind of that represents the best practice in terms of, the purpose in this case of the SOP, the scope of the SOP, and so on. So we have one of these for each section. It is important when you use this kind of functionality, though, to review it, because as I mentioned before, AI can hallucinate and can give you kind of erroneous or incorrect answers. So before you use this functionality in our system, you have to agree to that, to kind of be vigilant and to review all the information. But it can sure help you increase your throughput and make a long, laborious, tedious job quite a lot less onerous. So that's an example. So here's another video. This one's for defect inspection. And, as I was telling you before about, going to Oklahoma and seeing those people working on a production machine, where 4 people were doing the QC checks coming out the other end, that was possible because it was kind of a single line linear production process where the products were coming out one at a time, and it was kind of manageable to have humans do the job. You could imagine, trying to do the quality control checks, and checking every piece when you have this kind of velocity that's happening here. So obviously, when you have, many products that are coming down the line, it becomes impossible for a human to, simply look at each one. Whereas the AI system can analyze them all as they're coming by and even kick out ones that are defective. Okay. Another place where you can use AI quite often is on the IoT side. So if you're, typically what would happen is you may have sensors connected to various aspects of your production equipment and your HVAC system, et cetera, wash water concentrations, you have all these different sorts of sensors that work. So you can bring those all into the your AI-enabled system to help you identify anomalies and let you know kind of when you need to take action, not just when sort of deviations or nonconformities occur, but in advance of those occurring. So it can actually help anticipate when those failures, might occur so that you can take actions before they happen. So, previous to introducing AI functionality in our system, we kind of had, critical limits on the high and the low side. And then we also had kind of a little bit of a buffer operational limits on the inside of those extremes, so that you could kind of get an alert, for example, as the temperature is rising before it's become critical. But we didn't have kind of a way to predict things, what the sort of trend might be in real time. So using AI for that is dramatically improves the capabilities of those sorts of systems. There's also an interesting kind of side effect that is probably going to occur here, which is that a lot of times, in an auditor, when they come in, they're going to look at your logs, your temperature logs, for example, and they're going to want to see kind of a contiguous record to make sure there were no holes in it. And I think that there's going to have to be some adjustments on the regulatory side, because once we have it, AI becomes more kind of ubiquitous and more permeates more deeply into the production processes, across the industry. What we're going to see is that we don't necessarily need that same degree of control, because the systems can kind of let only when it's really becoming critical, as opposed to having to have continuous monitoring. If you have a device, for example, that can just let you know when problems are about to occur, you don't necessarily need to keep a record of everything that kind of leads up to that. Or if things are just operating nominally, that there's no point having a record. And the reason why you might not want to do that is that you can save a lot of kind of energy. So from a sustainability perspective, instead of having to broadcast continuously, you can only do it when it's required. So that is going to require regulatory changes if we're going to be able to take advantage of that. That's really my point. Another place where we're using AI is in predictive hazard analysis. So here's an example from chia seeds. There's a lot of text here, so I won't read it all to you. I've just highlighted the important parts in red, but I had no idea what the hazards were in chia seeds, so I fed this into our system, and it identifies the fact that in terms of biological hazards, that there's salmonella contamination. Physical hazards, they're really none other than choking. Chemical hazards, could be contaminated with pesticides. Allergens, some people do have allergenic reactions to chia seeds. It's not a major one, but it's something to consider. And on the green side, radiological hazards, there's no known radiological hazards at all. So once you identify these hazards, then you can control them as you're developing your HACCP plan. But having AI to help you identify the hazards from unfamiliar ingredients is a big advantage. So how to innovate with AI? You can use it for product design. Taste and flavor automation, I think in particular, is something that's really going to be a big opportunity. I had a podcast yesterday where we had a person from the Canadian Innovation Foundation on who had been previously an expert in flavor development and identifying kind of new proteins, new compounds, that have unique flavor profiles, that might not exist in the market before, amazing amazing opportunities there. There was a company that develops pharmaceuticals that had an AI system that they built for identifying beneficial human compounds. And they also used it to kind of run it in reverse. And they spent, I think, 6 hours identifying harmful compounds. And in that particular time frame, they found most known chemical warfare agents. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, but the fact that it could, do what took centuries of chemists to accomplish in just 6 hours is really quite amazing. So flavor optimization, texture and appearance analysis, nutritional optimization. This can be actually within the context of a particular product, or it might be something that's also related to personal health. So you can have very personal, you might be able to tune your dietary suggestions based on your personal situation. And one area that was pointed out to me that this might be useful is in, currently there's all sorts of glucose control medications like Ozempic on the market, to be able to determine, kind of how that affects a person's dietary needs and to design a diet that takes that into consideration, on a personal basis, could be a whole new area of development where AI can really play a role. You can also do the consumer insights and trend prediction, as I kind of mentioned before a little bit when it comes time to production forecasting. So you can build those into your systems as well. So here's another case study. I should mention when it comes to case studies, it's really hard to find actual case studies where people have gainfully used AI, and made money. So there's a lot of theoretical stuff. There's a lot of pilot projects going on. But not too many organizations are well positioned to take full advantage of AI. So we were able to find some examples for you. And here's one from a US cheese manufacturer. And essentially what they did is they used AI and trained their model. It took them about 6 months to do that. They looked at 29 different processing variables, including kind of the starting culture of the cheese, the mixing time, the raw milk composition, and classified the impacts on the final moisture content. And their goal in this particular case was to come up with a system that, or like a formulation or manufacturing process that increases the weight, because they sell cheese by weight. So the more it weighs, the more money they can generate. And through this process, they were able to increase the average moisture content by 0.6% and still stay within the regulatory compliance limits. And that particular, even though it was such a small savings or a small addition in terms of the moisture content, it translated directly into $1 million a year in revenue for them. So it doesn't necessarily even have to be huge advances in order to make money from it. Even sometimes even small changes can be quite beneficial. Here's another example of a lemonade product that a company made, and they wanted to develop a new 2-liter lemonade drink, and they wanted to bring it to market, in a short period of time. And they also wanted to have less than 5 grams of sugar per 100 milliliters. Still seems fairly high to me in terms of sugar content, but apparently lemonade has a lot of sugar in it. So that teaspoon per 100 milliliters, which I guess would be like 3.5 in a typical can, is much better than what's currently in the market. So they developed the ability to do that, and they figured that their costs of doing it was reduced by pretty much a third. So that was a big savings in terms of their product design costs for them. So it could analyze their ingredient interactions, the processing conditions, the consumer taste preferences, and really lead to a much more efficient mechanism by which you can develop products that are still tasty, with optimized flavors and good textures, and like I said before, nutritions. So now we'll talk a little bit about the use of AI in forecasting. So here I have an example again from our system about for sales forecasting. So this is live data, and what we're looking at here is a sales trend, and the part that is not in orange is the historical sales. And you can see that there's kind of a break, and then going forward, the dark red line is the trend line, and then the kind of lightly shaded orange bits is kind of a cone of probability. So what they're saying here is that there's a margin of error, and the farther you go out, the bigger the cone gets. But it kind of gives you an indication that the sales in this particular scenario is going to probably be quite flat, maybe trending slightly upwards, within the context of a fairly significant variation. The important thing to take away from this slide really is that in order to kind of get to the place where you need to, you can produce these forecasts, you need historical data to work off of. So if you're currently writing things down now, with a pen and paper, I would suggest that you start recording everything digitally, even if it's in Excel, for example, just so that later on you can feed it into your AI model. Because in order to get these predictions going out, you need the historical data going back in time, and 14 months is pretty much the minimum that you require. So if you're not collecting data electronically now, do so going forward. But there are, these systems aren't necessarily perfect. Like if you look at this one, which is also live data from a major retailer, you can see the customer complaint trend over time, and the cone of probability, kind of goes up and down, and it shows the sort of trend line, and is expecting that future customer complaints should still conform to that trend line. The problem with it is that if you notice that the cone of probability drops down below 0%, even though we programmed the AI to tell it that there's, that you can't go below 0 customer complaints, it still considers a cone of probability that goes below. So I don't know, maybe it's anticipating that there's customer compliments, in addition to complaints. I don't know. But that's an example of, kind of how the AI systems aren't completely perfect at the moment, but it still provides some sense of confidence that your customer complaints are not trending in the wrong direction, which is important. Another place you can use it is in projected costing. So there's two kind of aspects of this one as well, which is that so anytime you do a formulation, this is a screenshot from our system, and it's showing you for a particular formula, what's the cost of ingredients, materials, packaging, and how much labor's expended, overhead. This is obviously training data because it's not complete. But if you look at this and you do your projected costs going forward, you can use AI to anticipate what the future costs of your raw material increases might look like, and also to potentially examine alternative ingredients that might help you be able to reduce the cost as well. So these AI systems that have access to copious quantities of data can look at many different combinations, also anticipate what the flavor profile and the texture profiles, how they might change with different options, and make recommendations for you that you can then test and reduce your projected cost of production in terms of your formulations. So now I want to talk a little bit about a couple of maintenance kind of use cases. And maintenance is another area where it's really low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of opportunity for maintenance. To give you an example, in the outside of the food industry, cities typically would go down a street and replace, periodically every street light, whether or not it needed to be the street, the bulb was about to burn out or not. Using AI, you can get predictive maintenance. You can put sensors on the device that'll tell you, in advance when a piece of equipment, like a light bulb in that case, is going to fail, so that you can go and you can be more targeted in terms of your maintenance activity. So instead of just sort of routinely replacing everything, if you can get a little bit more data, a little bit more intelligence, kind of analyze it, and then use AI's predictive capabilities, you can go and have more targeted maintenance that allows you to reduce your maintenance costs overall. It can be used for training and support. This is a fairly common application already. So they even have visual systems where you can look at a particular piece of equipment and it'll come up with maintenance for you. You can optimize your maintenance scheduling, getting the right people at the right place at the right time. Altogether is always challenging, so it can help with that, and it can help you with monitoring as well. Here's an example of a company called Tetra Pak Services that used AI-based product improvements and cloud-based training, human intelligence, human-machine collaboration applications to be able to predict their maintenance downtime. And they almost completely eliminated their downtime. So they put sensors to monitor things like vibration, for example, acoustical signals, and then it notified their maintenance team when things started to go off the optimum. And at that point, they were able to take action and prevent downtime almost completely as a result of that. So big advance there. There's also quite a few opportunities in terms of sustainability, which is a major driver right now. The investment community particularly is looking at sustainability. Even banks now are requiring sustainability statements or commitments in order to extend loans. Going forward, they might actually ask for data as well. I was talking to a couple of banks who said that they were considering doing that. Asking for proof that you're moving in the right direction in terms of sustainability. So using AI is one way that you can do that, through resource utilization efficiencies, through waste reduction, having sustainable packaging, even edible packaging I've seen, reducing overall energy consumption, which is a really big one, and that leads to greenhouse gas emission reductions. And here's a case study where there was a company who put on AI fault detection on their refrigeration systems at 39 locations, 100 systems overall, and they were able to achieve a 40% return on investment through reduced operational costs simply by monitoring their refrigeration system for faults. So in terms of the transition from legacy processes to AI-enabled processes, there's some positives and some negatives. So the positives include the creation of new jobs. So there's a lot of discussion about job losses. There's also going to be new jobs created, as with every technological advance. There's going to be increased economic efficiencies, very important in the food industry because the margins are very low. The competition is high. The margins are razor thin, so any economic efficiency can help you protect your market share and make more money, hopefully. Collaborative roles between machines and people. ideally, we're going to overall and over time reduce the amount of labor that's required. So hopefully, as a society, we'll experience more leisure time. And you need to manage your kind of skills as this is happening as well. So, one of the big questions is, outsource or are you going to develop things in-house? So if you're an enormous company, you have a multi-million-dollar, $1 billion R&D budget, you may want to consider everything in-house. But for most of us, we're probably going to have to collaborate with consulting firms, with device firms, with software firms to make this possible at all. There's also consequences for inaction. I don't want to be too scaremongery about this, but I think, again, with that very razor thin market kind of share, having loss of, if you can't kind of take advantage of these improvements as they're coming down the pike and incorporate them in your business processes and your production processes, while your competitors are kind of leapfrogging ahead of you, you may lose market share and also, kind of your margin potentially. So there is a lot of kind of difference for different sectors, I think, in this as well. And I think the ones that are most likely to adopt, kind of sometimes to some extent, whether or not they like it, is going to be the processed food manufacturing side, agriculture and raw material production, meat and alternative proteins, fast foods. I already saw a pilot from one fast food company where they were having an almost completely autonomous system where there were really nobody inside the fast food place. So that's coming, probably not immediately, but relatively soon. So if you're in any of those sectors, you may wish to, take a hard look at AI sooner rather than later. There's also some that are least likely to adapt. So if you're sort of farmers market level, artisan craft food, handcrafted cheeses, for example, artisan brewery, you may still be able to, build your reputation, your product line on the handcrafted aspect of the quality. And therefore it might not affect you quite as seriously. You might, very high-end gourmet or specialty foods that have, a reputation, think caviar from Russia, for example, those may still be okay. And very small, again, farmers market kind of scale, farming and agriculture probably aren't going to adopt this too much, at least not too soon. So what are the next steps you should take? Start collecting your data now. Like I said before, if you're writing every single symbol that you write on a piece of paper is wasted. Do not do that. Start collecting everything digitally, ideally in a comprehensive system like Icicle, but if not, then at least in Excel or Word or anything that you can easily feed into into an AI-enabled system later is a good way to get started. You really need to kind of understand the challenges that are involved. And one of the big challenges is going to be managing your workforce change. People are resistant to change. Your workers are going to be resistant. Not everybody is going to make the change, but it's important to understand what the challenges are so that you can communicate, you can act preemptively and help people, gain the new skills that they need. You need to set clear objectives. So what are you trying to accomplish? You need to, identify partners that are going to help you. The most successful AI projects that are currently have been implemented have been done through collaborative partnerships as opposed to kind of one-off with in-house. So building out your partner network, understanding where where people can, you can bring in other organizations to help you, or ideally work together is a great way. And our AI initiative is one of those ways to, help connect with others. And foster that culture, talk early to your employees about how they're going to adopt AI, explain to them how retraining is going to be available, if that's an option for you, and try to allay their fears essentially, and make sure that they understand that it's coming. If you want to work with us, always happy to do that. We have collaboration opportunities that we offer. Your ROI looks really good. We specifically work with food manufacturers, so that's our area of expertise. We allow you to digitize literally everything in your company, track everything, and it's all combined in one unified system. So one last pitch for our AI Food Tech Alliance. We do understand that nobody, not even us, has everything that's required. So we're collaborating with others, the hardware manufacturers, governments, AI experts, to try to kind of move together down the road of adopting this new and kind of exciting technology. So I think we have about 5 minutes left for questions. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask?
Steve, I do have some questions that our audience sent to us in advance. Quite a few of the registrants were very interested to see how they could apply AI to their business. With that said, for a food and beverage company just getting started with AI, where would be the best place to start?
I would actually start with going digital. First of all, that's number one. So you have to start, in order for the AI to kind of function efficiently, you need a year plus worth of data. So the first thing that you should do is adopt some sort of digital system, whether it be ours or others, that allows you to avoid using pen and paper and having everything electronic.
And in what areas can AI contribute the most to a company's bottom line?
I think in terms of resource utilization and the sustainability side, also identifying anomalies. Like for example, we had a company who, we have the ability to generate forecasted costs and then also track actual costs. And our AI system identified an anomaly in the packaging process where the costs were significantly higher than what was expected. That led to an investigation by our client, who found that there was a problem with a particular packaging machine that they hadn't been aware of before. And the bottom line was they saved $1.4 million a year just from that one change. So the ROI is really good, and that's one area where you could really use it.
To our attendees, just a reminder, you have the option to enter your questions into the chat or direct message myself if you'd like to stay anonymous. We're almost at the hour here, so we might not get to all of the questions today, so we'll make sure to follow up with you directly. Next question here, Steve. How can AI be used for inventory management?
So inventory management is like the main area for that. I mean, first of all, inventory management, there's the whole notion of, robotic inventory control that's AI driven. And so you could just tell your robot, hey, go get me, such ingredient from this bin location. We're still a little ways away from that. So that's not the area that I would say is like the most practical right now. What is the most practical is in terms of purchasing suggestions. So, looking at your sales, your planned production, both finished product production and precursor product production, considering the actual shelf life of materials, looking at your supplier options, lead times from your suppliers, taking all those different parameters in to come up with a comprehensive purchasing suggestion format that's going to make sure that you've got the raw materials that you need, delivered to your facility when you need them is the best way that I could see to use AI for inventory management at the moment.
Another comment here. I read somewhere that roughly 30% of food retailers use AI. What would you estimate the adoption rate is for the food manufacturing side of things currently?
I think it's a very kind of general notion that 30%. Do they use ChatGPT to generate their marketing content? Is that using AI? Yes, absolutely it is. Is that taking full advantage of AI? So I would say no. For 30% of food retailers, I don't think that high of a percentage is taking full advantage, throughout their entire their supply chain. That's for sure. And I can tell you it's much lower on the manufacturing side. I would venture to suggest that, other than using large ChatGPT type models, The vast majority of small and medium-sized food manufacturers are not using it at all. And then for the larger companies, which might represent a significant percentage by market share, but not by actual company count, they're using it mostly for the analytics side. So if you have an analytics system that's AI enabled, it can help you generate reports and dashboards and do forecasting going forward. But I would say that by company count, it's definitely probably less than 10%, and 5% would be my guess.
Got it. I think that's all the time we have for today. Just as a close off, thank you, Steve, so much for all the insights and incredible amount of information you shared with our audience today. Thank you for everyone who's participated and stayed until the end with us. It's great to see the food industry come together through these association events and educational sessions. We hope to see you join our Food Industry AI Alliance. If you're interested in learning more about iCycle's AI-assisted capabilities in food safety, traceability, warehouse management, production planning, procurement, and so much more, please feel free to reach out. A recording of today's session will be shared with you and will also be available through Food and Beverage Ontario and on our website, iCycleTechnologies.com. Again, my name's Romina, and I hope to stay connected with you all and see you at our next webinar. Cheers and enjoy the rest of your day.